Hello, my name is Brian Casey, and we are here at RSNA 2022. Right now we are here with Dr. Paul Chang. He is Professor and Vice Chair of Radiology Informatics at the University of Chicago. Dr. Chang, thanks for being with us.
Glad to be here.
So we talk every year about kind of the state of AI in radiology, and so it's been a year since we talked. What do you see happening right now?
Well, I mean, it's always hard to come up with new stuff because things don't move that quickly. Although, as we said in the past, it's totally predictable that, especially with respect to artificial intelligence and radiology, you would expect that our appetites are much bigger than our ability to consume. And we've talked about the Gartner hype cycle, that we tend to overpromise, underdeliver, and then we kind of go into this trough of disillusionment where we basically said, it's oversold, you lied to us, it's not going to work. And what people don't realize is that we eventually get there. We eventually learned with some time how to appropriately consume any sort of new disruptive technology. And artificial intelligence is no different. This year, it's interesting. I actually am more optimistic, even though when you're objective and look at the evidence, people tend to be more pessimistic. I actually think that's a healthy sign. When you look at the literature, for instance, you see more and more papers describing AI algorithm drift, where performance in the real world doesn't reflect what was sold or what was done in the lab. Perfectly understandable, perfectly predictable. There's this concept in engineering called hysteresis, where the inputs always lag the outputs, where there's always this delay in actually seeing the results of any sort of perturbation in the system. And so even though what we're seeing is evidence that seems pessimistic and negative, actually, when you look back at what's going on now, there's some exciting advances that we see over the last couple years that actually give me more optimism of things. We said that one of the major issues with AI is that the use cases were nice to haves, but not must haves and all that.
Age algorithms.
That kind of thing. And the reason being is that they were primarily driven by data availability rather than compelling use case. Where you're beginning to see vendors as well as investigators really look at the value proposition. You're beginning to see evaluations on what are the positive and possibly negative impacts of implementation of AI in clinical practices. That's a positive. And you're beginning to see evidence that implementation can add to the value proposition. That's a healthy thing. Unfortunately, it doesn't get a big press. It's not as sexy. So that's good. I think especially people are beginning to understand that users have to be polycapable when it comes to AI. They just can't look at the convolutional neural network or image-based algorithms. I'm very, very pleased to see that people are now embracing much more transformational or what people call foundational type models, attention-based approaches, especially with the application of these approaches to natural language processing. I think you're going to see that natural language processing, AI-enabled or optimized natural language processing, is really going to show significant positive impact throughout the value chain. I think we've talked in the past that even though the value proposition of radiology seems to be concentrated on what I do in the reading room when I generate a narrative report, actually it turns out that a lot of the efficiency and productivity potential resides upstream from what I do. And the application of these more foundational transformer or attention-based approaches, especially in NLP, have great potential to reduce variability, improve efficiency upstream. And you're beginning to see not only that in the literature, you're beginning to see that on the vendor floors where people are beginning to understand it's not just about image algorithms, that NLP is also there. That's a positive. But again, that hysteresis, you're seeing that excitement, right? The capability of the fundamental science is getting better, addressing a lot of the deficiencies of early type algorithms and approaches, but there's always going to be this gap before we realize this in the clinical area. That's a predictable, healthy sign. That being said, I think we talked about the 5 kind of major issues about AI that are restricting its ability to grow. We talked about the use case, the value proposition. I think there's some positive there, people understanding, looking at upstream, looking at NLP, looking at other things, and more importantly, people actually investigating the value proposition explicitly is a positive. The concept of trust and generalizability in AI is still valid, and as I said, this hysteresis phenomenon is really keen there, where you're seeing the papers just come out actually being more pessimistic, right? These algorithm drift, that kind of thing. But in the back, you're beginning to see people take a very serious look at how to make sure these algorithms are not just statically trained, but are continuously trained in feedback either by the vendors or by investigators or hopefully by users with better governance driven type approaches that look at the entire AI algorithm life cycle. That's a positive, right? So even though you see these papers that are negative, hysteresis, people are beginning to understand that. The concept of data interoperability, that's always a stickler, that's always the problem. That's the reason why the early use cases were not that, I mean, they're nice, but they weren't must-haves because they were not driven by the value proposition, but rather driven by data availability. Right. I think the positive there is while many institutions are not yet ready to pull the trigger on investment in the required data interoperability to support AI, they are willing to invest for infrastructure to optimize data interoperability for data analytics, big data. They're sold on that. And hitching your wagon, to me, that's always a great hedge strategy. Hitch your wagon to whatever analytics initiatives are in the hospital, because what's good for analytics is good for AI. Right. So I see positives in that. Workflow orchestration, that's still a problem, all right? We're still kind of trying to be lazy at this on both sides. The startups and the traditional IT vendors, the PACS vendors, EMR vendors, speech recognition vendors, they still kind of want to control the narrative, right? It's a kind of I think, frankly, a lazy approach, because we cannot recapitulate the CAD model, where the AI algorithm and the human work in parallel. We only meet at the edge. We might fiddle with the work list, we may fiddle with some key images or some cues or hints. And that's not going to maximize the potential of what AI can do with human. What we're looking for is real-time, evidence-driven, state-aware, optimized human-machine workflow collaboration, real-time, synchronous. That's going to require a fundamental, as we talked about last time, it's going to require a fundamental change in the architecture, how this works. There, I'm beginning to see certain glimmers of hope that people are beginning to understand that we just can't view AI like a CD burner or CD reader. So it cannot be viewed as just a peripheral to the PACS. It has to be viewed as, it requires a fundamental re-engineering of the systems. You're beginning to see vendors understand that, and I think that's a positive. I think the last thing that I find that's optimistic is people are beginning to talk about the boring stuff like governance. In fact, later on this week, I'm moderating a panel discussion on governance. Go figure. That's a good sign. When you start dealing with how do you herd the cats. What we don't want to do. A sign of immaturity of implementation of technology is when we fail to herd the cats. And we've gone through this, for instance, 3D workstations. Oh my gosh, remember those days where everybody, a vascular surgeon would want their brand of 3D workstation, a cardiologist would want theirs, radiology would want theirs, and then we're stuck supporting
with all these different workstations.
Workstations. We're herding the cats and all that, and there was no real formal governance that really looked at the value proposition, safety, performance, scalability, economics. When you begin to do the hard, important, but boring work of governance, that's when you're beginning to be more mature.
That's when things are getting real.
Exactly, when it becomes real, that we're going to do this in a real way that's sustainable and scalable. And you're beginning to see a lot of talk on that, and that's a positive. Even though it sounds boring and not very sexy, it's a very important thing. So Bottom line, I think we're slightly moving away from that trough of disillusionment. You know, the Gartner High Cycle talks about slope of enlightenment.
Okay.
Yeah, we're just beginning to do that. I see some positives. People have to understand, though, this concept of hysteresis. You know, when you look at the literature, seems pessimistic, but that's okay because there's this latency, this delay between, you know, the evidence and the technology and progress that's actually happening. I'm actually optimistic that we're going to be able to find our way, and we always do. I mean, it doesn't matter what I feel. We always get there eventually. We learn how to appropriately use it.
Good deal. All right, well, that's something to look forward to.
Okay.
All right, well, thanks for being with us.
Sure enough.
All right,
Take care.
Signing off from RSNA, my name is Brian Casey.